I have been seeing an individual who goes by the moniker Wi-Fi Gospel engaging in a lot of debates online lately. He is a proponent of presuppositional apologetics. While I am, of course, no stranger to criticizing presuppositional apologetics, it has been a while since I've engaged with it. In the past, I have also primarily engaged with the reformed Van Tillian brand of presuppositionalism. I have not engaged the Eastern Orthodox version, proffered by the likes of J. Dyer and Father Deacon Ananias Sorem, which, as I understand it, is the version which Wi-Fi Gospel prefers. So I thought I would take some time to go through some of Wi-Fi's debates, where he presents and defends his version of the Transcendental argument, and explain where I think his defenses fall short. I do this in a spirit of friendliness, and in the hopes that my critiques will make Wi-Fi more sympathetic to an evidentialist apologetic. I firmly believe that a form of evidentialism, albeit perhaps not as strong as the version that I would advocate, is the most consistent with the basic approach to apologetics utilized by the early Christian church. And given that Wi-Fi is at least sympathetic to Eastern Orthodoxy, I assume that the opinions of the early church mean a great deal to him. Wi-Fi seems like a generally nice guy, which is in refreshing contrast to the vast majority of presuppositionalists who seem to just want to beat people over the head with philosophy. As such, I will endeavor to keep the tone of this video as friendly as possible. It is interesting to see how allergic most presuppositionalist Christian apologists are to presenting the transcendental argument in the form of a syllogism. This can easily be seen by, for example, J. Dyer's tiresome evasiveness in monologues when directly asked for a syllogism. Fortunately, Wi-Fi has a syllogistic version of his transcendental argument, which makes it much easier for us to follow his reasoning, at least in broad strokes.
I've put together a few syllogisms to make my argument. The first one: if knowledge is possible, then God exists. Knowledge is possible, therefore God exists. This is known as modus ponens.
It's very simple and to the point. The argument is also undeniably logically valid. So the next question, of course, regards why Wi-Fi thinks that the premises are true. The second premise isn't going to be very controversial, although, for reasons I will explain later, Wi-Fi's defense of it leaves much to be desired. So the really critical premise of this argument is the first premise. Why think that premise 1 is true? Well, fortunately, Wi-Fi has a further syllogism to offer in defense of this premise. He formulates it as follows.
And a lot of people have a problem with the first premise. They say, well, how does knowledge being possible mean God exists? It doesn't really connect in their mind, and I totally get that. So the question you want to ask is, how do we validate the conditional connection in premise 1? And we do so like this. Either God is a necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge or not. It is not the case that God is not necessary. Therefore, God is a necessary condition. This is a disjunctive syllogism, and it uses a valid inference rule known as double negation elimination, which is upheld by the law of excluded middle. And it's A or not A, not A, therefore A. Basically, just the law of excluded middle.
While I again appreciate Wi-Fi providing a syllogism, I have to wonder about the utility of this one. The first premise is, of course, a true dichotomy, and so shouldn't be controversial. But I struggle to distinguish the second premise of this argument from the first premise of the original argument. To say that, if knowledge is possible, then God exists, is just another way to say that it is not the case that God is not a necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge. So at best, this further syllogism isn't providing anything in addition to the first premise, and fails to answer our question regarding why the first premise should be accepted. At worst, Wi-Fi appears to be offering a circular defense of the first premise of the original argument. Either way, we have not been given any additional reason to accept the first premise of the original argument. Regardless, we can still ask Wi-Fi to justify the second premise of his second argument, since, because it is essentially a reiteration of the first premise of his first argument, a justification of one will be a justification of the other. He offers us a third argument in defense of this premise.
And then the final syllogism I'm going to use is in the form of modus tollens that performs a reductio of all worldviews that exclude God. So if not a autonomous epistemology means that that we can't, if that's not true, then it means that theonomous epistemology is true. So we must make autonomous epistemology not true. If autonomous epistemology is true, reason must justify itself. Reason cannot justify itself without circularity. Therefore, autonomous epistemology is not true.
So Wi-Fi's precise formulation of his argument in this clip is incredibly unclear. This is my absolute best attempt to formalize it for him. 1. Either theonomous epistemology is true, or autonomous epistemology is true. 2. If theonomous epistemology is not true, then autonomous epistemology is true. 3. Autonomous epistemology entails that reason can justify reason without circularity. 4. Reason cannot justify itself without circularity. 5. Therefore, autonomous epistemology is not true. 6. Therefore, theonomous epistemology is true. I did ask Wi-Fi about the accuracy of this formulation. He didn't wholeheartedly affirm it, but he also said that he thought that he could agree to it. He just thought it included extra unnecessary steps. So if this formulation is a fair approximation of what Wi-Fi intended his argument to be, then the argument is valid, but the first premise looks incredibly suspicious. Notice that unlike his last argument, the first premise is not a simple statement according to which either one proposition or its negation is true, so it's not obviously a true dichotomy. Consequently, it's worth asking if theonomous epistemology and autonomous epistemology are the only possible options. I presume that by autonomous epistemology, Wi-Fi probably means any epistemology that is not theonomous epistemology. But that doesn't actually exhaust the logical space of possibilities here. It could also be the case that no epistemology is true. It could be the case that global skepticism is true. Granted, Wi-Fi Gospel does have an argument that I will get to later, according to which global skepticism is necessarily false, and so is not possible. But since I will suggest that this argument fails, I do think that the first premise of this argument expresses a false dichotomy. Yet, even if we were to take global skepticism off the table, there is a further reason to believe that the first premise expresses a false dichotomy. Recall that the only way to make the first premise even look like a true dichotomy is by defining autonomous epistemology as any epistemology which is not theonomous epistemology. This means that autonomous epistemology is not really a single theory of knowledge, but rather an umbrella category for any epistemology that doesn't rely upon God. This will, of course, include the vast majority of epistemological theories. This becomes relevant when we look at the third and fourth premises, because although he doesn't explicitly define the term autonomous epistemology the way that I have in the third premise, he cannot infer the conclusion without that premise. In other words, Wi-Fi's argument here only works if literally all non-theistic epistemologies are committed to the thesis that reason can justify itself without circularity. That, after all, was the premise which allowed Wi-Fi to infer that autonomous epistemology is false. However, it is not the case that all non-theonomous epistemologies would say that reason can justify itself without circularity. For example, most externalist theories of knowledge explicitly deny the need for justification at all, and even the ones that do insist upon justification, such as Michael Bergman's, do not claim that justification cannot be circular. Instead, epistemologies like Bergman's explicitly endorse epistemic circularity. So even if these epistemologies couldn't be justified apart from circularity, that would not by itself mean that they are false, since circularity is literally built into them. One would need an independent argument against the idea that epistemically circular reasoning can ever be justificatory. Even internalists like myself, who do reject circular reasoning, do not typically claim that reason justifies itself without circularity. What does it even mean to justify reason? Reason is not a proposition capable of being true or false, yet justification is simply that which either guarantees or indicates the truth of a proposition. Hence, for Wi-Fi to even speak of a non-propositional process like reason being justified at all seems to me to be a category error. In short, the categories of autonomous epistemology, defined as the thesis that reason has to be able to justify itself without circularity, and non-theonomous epistemologies, defined as any epistemology which is not theonomous epistemology, are not coextensive categories. So at best, Wi-Fi's argument only shows that epistemologies which do depend upon the thesis that reason can justify itself without circularity, if any of these even exist, are false. But that doesn't cover all, or even most theories of knowledge that don't make reference to God. Consequently, the first premise is indeed a false dichotomy. Moving on to Wi-Fi's primary argument for the second premise of his original argument, he claims that the denial of this premise is allegedly contradictory. His justification for this claim is that one has to know that knowledge is impossible in order to say that knowledge is impossible.
It's actually a contradiction to say that knowledge is impossible. Why? Because you would have to actually know that knowledge is impossible in order to say that knowledge is impossible. Now, if you try to back up and say, well, I don't know, I just think or believe that knowledge is impossible, what you've really admitted is that you could be wrong. And if it's possible that you could be wrong, then it's possible that knowledge is possible, right? Even the denial of knowledge presupposes the possibility of knowledge. So the statement, knowledge is possible, is necessarily true. You can't get around that.
So I have really serious concerns about this statement. To be very clear up front, I obviously don't disagree with this premise. I fully believe that knowledge is both possible and actual. But my reasons for affirming this premise are rationalistic in nature. Obviously, my rationalist epistemology is not going to be compatible with Wi-Fi's presuppositionalist project. So although we both agree on the truth of this premise, we agree for very different reasons. And since one of my primary criticisms of presuppositional apologetics is that the sort of epistemological conclusions that it implies actually do make knowledge impossible, it is important for us to see that Wi-Fi cannot justifiably affirm this premise given his presuppositionalist epistemology. All that just to say that I'm challenging Wi-Fi's reasoning in defense of this premise, not the truth of it. So let's consider his claim that in order to say that knowledge is impossible, one would have to know this. This statement surely seems to be predicated upon the principle that in order to say something, one has to know it. But obviously that's not true. One can say all sorts of things without knowing them. Quite evidently, I can say something that I don't even believe, in the case of lying, for example. But if I don't even believe what I'm saying, then I can't possibly know what I'm saying. I could also say and believe something, but my belief could fail to be either true or justified, in which case it would not be known. So one can plainly say something without knowing it. However, I think we can construct a more charitable interpretation of Wi-Fi's statement. I suspect that he means that one cannot rationally commit to, accept, and defend the idea that knowledge is impossible without believing that they know this to be true. But if this is known to be true, then knowledge is possible, and so this premise is true. I strongly suspect that this is what Wi-Fi intends to convey. The problem here is that if this interpretation of Wi-Fi's statement is correct, then it is simply not true that the denial of his premise results in a logical contradiction. To see why, we need to appreciate an important distinction between self-refutation and self-defeat. This distinction is unfortunately commonly overlooked by apologists who use these terms interchangeably, but they actually refer to different things. A self-refutation occurs when a position contradicts itself and is therefore necessarily false, whereas self-defeat occurs when a position is committed to something which entails that it cannot be rationally believed or justified. Let me give an example of each. It is self-refuting to say that I am a married bachelor. Why? Because the notion of being married is logically incompatible with the notion of being a bachelor, so there is a logical contradiction involved in this statement. On the other hand, it would be self-defeating to say that I do not exist. There is nothing contradictory about the proposition that I do not exist. However, if I did not exist, then I could not possess any justification for believing that I do not exist. And therefore, the statement that I do not exist is self-defeating, even though its truth remains logically possible. Unfortunately for Wi-Fi, the proposition that knowledge is impossible is not logically contradictory. It would be self-defeating if someone were to try to claim to know that knowledge was impossible, but nothing about this implies that knowledge actually is possible. At best, Wi-Fi has merely established that we have to believe that knowledge is possible on pain of self-defeat. But that is very different than establishing that the negation of his premise is logically contradictory. Denial of this premise is self-defeating, but it is not self-refuting, and Wi-Fi needs it to be self-refuting in order to sustain his claim that denying it leads to a contradiction. This premise is not true by logical necessity, as he asserts. Now, when it comes to the question of how Wi-Fi solves the perennial problems of epistemology, unsurprisingly, he believes that God is the solution in some way. So one might reasonably wonder how Wi-Fi thinks that God explains logic, induction, the reliability of sensory perception, and so on. His answer seems to be that we can know these things because God reveals them to us.
If there is a God who has created the universe and humans with the intention for us to know him and know the universe, it follows that he could reveal things to us such that we can know them for certain. And it also follows that we would be able to use epistemic theories such as empiricism in order to know things. The difference is that we, an example of empiricism, don't have to rely on our senses in order to justify our senses. And so, as a Christian or as someone who believes in God, how do we know that our senses are reliable? Because God has created the universe and humans with the intention for us to know him and know the universe. And how do we know that's true? The impossibility of the contrary. Because if it were not true, knowledge would be impossible. And we know that that statement itself is contradictory. So again, if there is no God, then we cannot use revelation as a way to justify how we know things, to justify our epistemic theories. If there is a God who created and sustained the world and everything in it, a God who created us to know him, the world, and each other, then we can use our senses, reason, memory, etc. to know things. We can justify the use of our reasoning tools, not by referring back to those tools, but by pointing to the creator of those tools. If you try to remove God from the equation, you end up in a vicious circle, unable to justify your epistemology.
An immediate question that arises here is what sort of revelation Wi-Fi has in mind. Is he talking about the Bible or church tradition? It's very hard to see how these mediums of revelation could be serving as the foundation for our knowledge of, say, the reliability of sensory perception. Presumably, whatever we learn from scripture or tradition depends upon sensory inputs. If these were unreliable, then we couldn't know that scripture or tradition really said what our senses indicated. So these mediums of revelation are going to be unhelpful. Perhaps Wi Fi has some sort of inner witness of the Holy Spirit in mind as the source of revelation. But just as one can ask whether or not sensory perceptions are veridical and reliable, one can also ask if this inner witness is veridical and reliable. Regardless of the medium, I want to ask how Wi Fi proposes that we are justified in believing God's revelation in the first place. Just here is where we hit a snag. When I have asked presuppositionalists this question in the past, they overwhelmingly answer by saying that God's revelation is self justifying. That is to say, it is justified in a circular fashion. Now, the concern that I have here is twofold. If that is also Wi Fi's answer, then this creates significant tension with many of his other statements expressing his conviction that circular reasoning is a fallacy and that interlocutors within a debate are not allowed to engage in it.
So, how does one using autonomous epistemology answer the question, how do you know your senses are reliable? Because in this question, the reason we ask this question is when somebody tries to use empiricism as an epistemic theory, meaning that we can know things based on empirical observations and data. So the only answer that most people have given me is that they observe past instances of their senses being reliable. You ask other people if they experience the same things that you're currently experiencing. And that we have doctors that use machines to test our senses. The problem is, in order to observe any of those tests or measures, you'd have to actually use your senses, the very thing in question. Think about it. The first one, observing your past instances of your senses being reliable. In any way of do that, you're relying on your memory, you're relying on your past use of your senses, right? Your senses could have not been reliable. How do you know that? If you're asking other people the way that you get their experience, whether they write it down, whether they speak it to you audibly, you have to use your senses in order to take that information in. And then the same thing again with doctors that use machines. In order to read these machines, in order to get this information from the doctors, you have to use your senses, the very thing you're trying to prove reliable, and empiricism. And that's why we call it circular reasoning. The justification assumes the thing it's trying to justify. You can't do that. It's a logical fallacy. I use empiricism as a quick example. Give me any example. And if you have to use yourself to justify yourself, it's circular reasoning. Without God, you're left with autonomous epistemology. You start with yourself, using the necessary tools needed to gather knowledge, and then try to justify those tools by referring back to the very tools you're trying to justify. If you try to remove God from the equation, you end up in a vicious circle, unable to justify your epistemology. He may appeal to empiricism and say we know things through our senses, but this assumes the reliability of the senses, which cannot be proven without using the senses themselves. That's circular. You're using your eyes to test your eyes. He may appeal to rationalism, claiming we know through reason. But again, this assumes that reason is reliable and attempts to prove that using reason are equally circular. You're using your mind to validate your mind. In both cases, empiricism and rationalism depend on the very faculties that he's trying to justify. Unless he can escape that loop, he can't offer a non-circular foundation for knowledge.
If he truly stands by these emphatic rejections of circular reasoning, whether logical or epistemic, then he obviously cannot end up making an appeal to circular reasoning himself in order to justify his own belief that whatever he takes to be God's revelation actually is of divine origin or is true. And so we are returned to the original question. how do we know that a putative revelation comes from God and is true? The second concern is that if Wi-Fi does allow himself to let divine revelation justify itself in a circular fashion, then it's unclear how he can block the empiricist or anyone else from doing the same. If Wi-Fi is allowed to rest his theory of knowledge on an epistemically circular foundation, then why can't the empiricist do the same? His whole criticism of so-called autonomous epistemology is that it allegedly always ends up in circular reasoning. This would imply that his own epistemology does not, and that this is supposed to be an advantage of his epistemology over autonomous epistemology. However, if his epistemology has the exact same problem, then how is this supposed to be an argument in favor of his theory of knowledge? Now, perhaps Wi-Fi could make a shift into epistemological externalism and just deny that he needs any justification for his most foundational commitment to God's revelation. All he needs is for that revelation to be true. But in the first place, it's hard to see how this is an improvement over circular reasoning. After all, the whole problem with circular reasoning to begin with is that it is no better than just taking the very point at issue for granted. In the second place, the proponent of autonomous epistemology can make the same move. If Wi-Fi can just take God's revelation for granted without having to offer any justification, then presumably the empiricist can just take the reliability of sensory perception for granted without having to offer any justification. Either way, it's not clear how Wi-Fi can claim to have any advantage here. Alternatively, Wi-Fi could be truly consistent on this front like me, and reject circular reasoning in its entirety, but I am convinced that this will inevitably lead him away from presuppositionalism and down the path of strong evidentialism, radical internalism, and Cartesian rationalism. Certainly, this is the only epistemological theory that I have found which can both avoid global skepticism and also avoid epistemic circularity. To conclude, this video has critically assessed Wi-Fi Gospel's version of the Transcendental argument for God. I genuinely appreciate that, unlike most presuppositionalists, he offers a syllogistic version of his transcendental argument. I have questioned both premises of his master argument. I have judged his second argument, offered in defense of the first premise of his first argument, to be superfluous. I have judged that his third argument, offered in support of the first premise of his first argument, is unclear, at least as he has presented it. I have done my best to clarify what I think the argument is intended to say, and I have concluded that it is based upon a false dichotomy. I have accepted the second premise of Wi-Fi's argument as true, but I have challenged his claim that it is necessarily true, pointing out that his defense of it is predicated upon a confusion between self-refutation and self-defeat. Lastly, I have questioned Wi-Fi's implication that his so-called theonomous epistemology can avoid epistemic circularity. And since epistemic circularity was his main objection to all other epistemologies, it remains unclear how he can claim that theonomous epistemology has an advantage over them.